there is grounds in the story of Captain Swayze. The problem with Captain Swayze is he never existed. He's not a real person. So, as I say, the Harmonious Coach House Inn may well have a ghost, but it is not Captain Swayze. And the reason that I know this is during my archaeological work on the War of 1812 in the region, we were looking at that time, we were actually at the other fort. Niagara-on-the-Lake has two forts. It has Fort George and it has Fort Mississauga. And at the time, we were working on Fort Mississauga. And so we were looking at all of the old stories and all of the historical references. We were looking at officers' journals from the War of 1812. We were looking at a lot of different things. And as it came up, the Harmonious Coach House Inn, some of the officers did frequent it for a drink. But however, there was never a Captain Swayze. And the reason we know this is because I actually, knowing the story and having told that story myself several times when I worked for the other haunted tour company, it just never quite sat right with me. Knowing that as a battlefield archaeologist, you know, it just didn't work in my head, these whole circumstances. So I started to look into the Swayze family in the area. Okay. And the Swayzes are a very well-known family out of Connecticut originally, and even landed in Virginia going way back. But as loyalists, they came as loyalists, the family resettled in the Fort Erie, Niagara-on-the-Lake region. It was quite a large family. There was quite a number of them, several brothers. I believe there was 7 brothers originally. But four of them came up here along with the father and the mother and several of the daughters. And so they owned property. They were given property by the British Crown. And so their property started in as close to me. I live in Port Colborne, but there was property they were given in the Ridgeway area, the Fort Erie area. But none of it was ever given to them in any area around Niagara-on-the-Lake except for a little town called St. David. Now, St. David is literally the next town over from Niagara-on-the-Lake. And so when you look at the allotments given out, at that time there was a fairly large allotment of 700 acres given to Colonel Isaac Swayze and his brother. And so they shared this plot of land. Now they built 2 homes on it. One was the brother's house, and that one is it's hard. I don't know. Ian, do you know St. David at all?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, so do you know where the chocolate place is? The chocolate factory?
Yes,
in St. David? Okay,
yep.
So the house that belonged to Swayze was almost directly across the road from that factory. Okay, so that's where the Swayzes were. So the one brother and they had to build a home according to the regulations of the allotments. So the British government, the Crown, told anybody who was a loyalist that their house had to be at least 10 feet by 20 feet. It doesn't sound like a lot today, but when you're coming into an area that is wild, the trees are not cut. These are heavily forested areas. So you have to clear the land and you have to build a house within the first 2 years that you arrive. So you have to do this all by hand. So you're now cutting down trees and you're having to build, essentially log homes that fit this footprint in order to be able to keep your land. So that was the prerequisite. So it makes sense that the brothers combined their efforts and probably helped each other when they were doing this. Now, Colonel Isaac Swayze ended up moving into a bigger home and a stone-built home. Eventually, they built a stone home. So now let's wind the clock forward. It's the War of 1812. Okay, so Colonel Isaac Swayze, he's a rebel rouser. Okay, he does not like the Americans, and he is constantly in their face. And even when he's here on this side of the border, he is doing nothing but causing problems for the Americans. Because he lived in Connecticut, because he was an American, well, he was a loyalist, but he was living in this America he didn't like. He came here and he was putting out pamphlets, he was going to meetings, he was causing all kinds of problems for the Americans. They were pissed. They were not happy with him. And you can look this up. You can find all this information. It's really pretty fascinating how much he went, just went at them. And he really let people know his dislike for the Americans at that time. And so they had a bit of a hate on for him. And when they were in Newark or Niagara-on-the-Lake, when Brock was there, before Brock was killed, Swayze was also connected to Isaac Brock's regiment. So you can look at all this information, you can see it all. At no time is there a Captain Colin Swayze. So what happens to Colonel Isaac Swayze? This is his story. In St. David, after they had raised Newark or Niagara-on-the-Lake, they started marching towards St. David. They were looking for him. They were looking for Colin Swayze. They knew where they're looking for Isaac Swayze. They were moving towards the Swayze property. And the brother caught wind of it. And what happened was that Isaac hid under the house. So he brought his wife and his daughter to his brother's, and for protection, they all sort of holed up there. When some soldiers started coming up the path towards the house, yelling for him, Swayze went under the house. So the house would have been raised off the ground a few feet for airflow and he hid underneath the house. The soldiers came into the house, and they actually grabbed his brother. They took his wife, his brother's wife, and the daughter, and I'm not going to get into the graphic detail of what's described as to what they did to the women, but you can imagine what they did, and they did do it. And then they murdered them, all three of them, both wives and the daughter, and then they bludgeoned Swayze's brother to death with a bayonet. And that blood from his brother, when his brother fell on the floor, it ran through the floorboards and down onto Isaac below. He survived. They did not. So after that, he was furious, of course. He was really, really angry. And he really started again into a lot of what we would call propaganda today against the Americans. But it went on for years. And he did end up in some political posts. He did, manage to move himself forward. But so that horrendous incident is the story for the Angel Inn. Now, what's the connection? Because it's not even the same town, right? You've got St. David, Queenston Heights, Niagara-on-the-Lake. How did that get wrapped up into the Angel Inn? What happened is in the 1930s, when Niagara-on-the-Lake was starting to become this little tourist destination, the couple that bought the property wanted to have some kind of historical reference to the property and wanted to get tourists to come. So they did a little digging and they went into some archives in town. And obviously, if you're not familiar with looking at very old handwritten documentation, you're going to make mistakes. And this is where this story comes from. So I've looked at this exact documentation. It's written in hand. And what it says is, you look at the names, you go down, you can see the names, you can see some stories. There's, of course, the story of the Swayzes and what happened there. And I guess they kind of latched on to that and went, oh, wow, that's a cool story. It's got all the makings of a good ghost story. And what they did was, but when they looked at the name, the way that Colonel Isaac Swayze's name is written is like this. It goes COL period I Swayze. So what they did is they looked at the colonel, and I think they saw COLI and thought it was Colin, written without the N, because with handwritten, you can look, you might think that's Colin Swayze. And because he was military, and it does say that, but because they misreferenced COL instead of colonel, they gave him captain. So they called him Captain Colin Swayze. Never existed.
Okay.
He doesn't exist. So it was really Colonel Isaac. So C-O-L-I and then Swayze. So you can see how the mistake would easily be made from people who are not used to reading old, old registrations, officers' registrations, old papers, whatever, documents. So they took the story and they kind of ran with it and they attached it to the inn. And that's how they started to promote themselves, as a haunted inn. So it was a haunted destination. So they're one of the first ones in Niagara-on-the-Lake. And that's kind of a cool story, too, because they're one of the first ones to actually come forward and say that their inn is haunted. And, of course, it brought tourists, and it brought tourists to the destination. So the story has just been propelling forward ever since. So the story itself has become, I'm not going to say truth because it's not truth, but it is the story that everyone tells. And while it's a fun story, I think that the whole story is more interesting than the made-up story.